Thank you very much, Dave, for that gracious introduction. If you couldn't hear, he announced that I was a graduate of West Point, Nene. It's Annapolis. It's wonderful to see so many here tonight. I have to tell you, I'm actually a little surprised. You do have to do one favor for me in the back row. If I trail off, please stick up your hand and wave at me, and I will pick it back up. I want to thank, and I'm especially grateful to my friend Bill Cooper for his interest in putting together what I hope will be a good discussion of the challenges our nation faces from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but more importantly, most importantly, what it means with respect to China, the true strategic competitor to the United States over the course of this century, and China's drive to replace the United States as the world's global leader. I intend to speak for about 20 minutes, and then as Mel said, I'll be happy to take your questions, keeping in mind that I'll answer the ones I want to answer. Now, you've heard or seen many a discussion, lecture, address, analysis on TV or in a magazine somewhere that describe the times at hand. And invariably, they are described as the most important and often feel like the most troubling times the country has seen. Yet Americans are often troubled that the world is looking to us for solutions, and often with a sense of how in the world did this happen, whatever this is. Still others, myself included, often take away the reaffirmation of America's place in the world, why it is so important, and why it is absolutely in our nation's interest to indeed forge ahead by continuing to lead the world through not only this crisis, but through the countless others that are sure to follow. Why? Well, we are seeing in real time what authoritarian powers, dictators, are truly capable of in the 21st century. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine on February 24th is proof of that. Until the 24th, and for several years now, many have spoken of a new world, a multipolar world, and a new era of global competition or great power competition, and wondered what the purpose of this competition is or was, and disturbingly, even welcomed the possibility of change to the international world order that we know. Others have noted the relative changes in combat power, national power around the world in terms of combat and economic power, in population, in diplomatic reach, and access to resources, and changes to political alignments, and they called it the decline of the West. At best, it was hoped in this country that a rising global economy and a minimum amount of competition between nations would bring tensions only on the margins. That the liberal values, that is to say, the political and moral philosophy based on the rights of the individual, liberty, consent of the governed, and equality before the law, that these liberal values would be lifted and expanded across the globe automatically with the rising economic tide. And at worst, well, we can see what the world looks like now. We have the attempted, deliberate destruction of Ukraine, a sovereign nation, the disruption of the global economy, and sickeningly, the severe and even indiscriminate loss of life. This is the real world. In the United States, there will be some who will argue that this is not a threat to the homeland, as we say, or Americans abroad, so not to worry. In other countries, perhaps Ukraine seems even farther away. But those arguments are wrong. The preservation of the international order is absolutely in our American interest. America's role as the global leader in that international order is also absolutely in our interest, and I would submit in the world's interest as well. Now, I hope you all know who Thomas Paine was. Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, published it. It was the first call to revolution in the before the United States, in the colonies in 1776. Thomas Paine said, "The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind." And that cause is not nebulous. That cause is inalienable. You all know these words. You know them simply as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, set aside that map for a minute. Bear with me about the Pacific and China. In the last few years, through 2 administrations now, the United States, Japan, Australia, the United Kingdom, France, India, and some others have converged around the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Unsaid, but in there nevertheless, is the cause of all mankind, as Thomas Paine would say. How? What do we mean when we say free and open Indo-Pacific? When we say free, I mean free, both in terms of traditional security, free from even coercion, and in terms of values and political systems, with respect to individual rights and liberties, the promotion of good governance. Those are values that we share. Those are values that the nations I just mentioned share, and they're values that Thomas Paine would recognize. Free also means nations do not have to choose who they partner or trade with out of fear or coercion. Instead, they are free to exercise their sovereignty, their choice. When we say open in the phrase free and open Indo-Pacific, I mean open. All nations should enjoy unfettered, open access to the seas and airways upon which our economies and our people depend. And according to this vision, nations are able to have open investment environments, transparent agreements between one another, protection of intellectual property and property rights, and fair and reciprocal trade. Right? Free and Indo-Pacific. It is the nation's approach to the Indo-Pacific. It has been through 2 administrations, and we are partnering with other nations, Japan, Australia, India, France, the UK, to get that done. Sounds simple? Well, the idea is simple. Getting it done is the hard part, because we must attract other nations to this vision. We must put together the ways and means to uphold, ensure, and enforce this vision using everything the nation is capable of. Our allied power, our national power, our economic power, our diplomatic power, and yes, our military power. And we must be willing to risk that when others oppose this vision, we will rise to the challenge. Again, using all elements of that national power and the power of our allies, diplomatically, economically, and yes, militarily. Free and open. Why? Because we know what closed and authoritarian will do. You're seeing it. In Russia, we know now that the strategic signs were all there. Russia's invasion of the country of Georgia in 2008. Their annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. The war in the east of Ukraine, the Donbass, and Russia's efforts in Syria over the course of nearly a decade now. Putin's long-term effort to try and insulate Russia from economic sanctions, to create leverage with energy resources and transportation pipelines, among other efforts, and his willingness to parlay the very false, untrue narrative of the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine. These were all signs. He told us what he intended to do. And now this, it's real. Russia's invasion of another sovereign nation. Thousands of Ukrainians dead, 3.5 million Ukrainian refugees cast across Europe and the Caucasus. These are lives and liberties lost. The cause of all mankind, the cause of America, as Thomas Paine told us. It may be true that the inability to prevent Putin from invading Ukraine was a deterrence failure. Perhaps the free world did not mean to deter him, or perhaps Putin simply could not be deterred. It is clear that he had two objectives. First, destroy Ukraine, a democratic state on his border. And second, to shatter the NATO alliance. So far, and somebody needs to ask me after this why I said so far and for now. So far, Putin has failed with the second. For now, NATO has been unified and galvanized. But we are a long way from knowing whether the measures taken now will cause Putin to fail in his effort to destroy Ukraine. But we do know this already. Ukraine is in ruins. I'll say it again. Ukraine is in ruins. So now think about this across the rest of the world. In the People's Republic of China, what does Chairman Xi make of this? That's a good question. In China, I will tell you from my own experience out at Indo-PACOM and from studying this for many years now, the strategic signs are also there. The list is long. What have they done? They've militarized, this is some diplomatic speak, and I'm going to correct it here in a minute. They've militarized some artificial features in the South China Sea. That means they have built islands out of rocks, put air bases on them, surface-to-air missiles, coastal defense cruise missiles. They're operating fighter aircraft, they're operating bomber aircraft, they're operating surveillance aircraft. They are running fishing vessels and fisheries service, something that the United States doesn't have, but fisheries service vessels in and around the Senkaku Islands, which are administratively controlled by Japan and supported by the United States in that, violating with incursions in that area. They've enslaved the Uyghurs in the western part of China in what is nothing less than concentration camps. They have implemented a national security law in Hong Kong 25 years in advance of an agreement. They've increased their air and maritime activities near Taiwan, near Japan, a country allied to the United States that we are obligated for mutual defense between our two nations, as well as the US territories of Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands. And there's more to their strategic signalings. They have staggering growth in their air and their maritime forces, and in rocket forces, their cyber forces, and their space capabilities. They are economically coercing Korea, Australia, Canada, and others. What does that mean? I will give you the best example I can give you. Australia was debating a law in their legislature about whether they should closely examine foreign investments in the country of Australia to see if it was inappropriately challenging their own sovereign. Unsaid in all that was about Chinese investments in Australia. Just for their debate of that law, the Chinese let beef and wine and coal, all from Australia, stack up in Chinese ports for months. And they're holding them hostage on other things. And I could talk to you about Korea and Canada and some others later. They've undertaken a long-term effort to insulate their own country by stockpiling energy and rare earth or strategic minerals. What do we use rare earth or strategic minerals for? Lithium batteries, semiconductor manufacturing, solar cells. Everything we think about with robotics in the future is dependent on rare earth or strategic minerals. And they started this global initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative, and they have a diplomatic theme called Wolf Warrior Diplomacy, which is based on a series of movies that they came out with. They have these Wolf Warrior movies, they're almost like the Rambo movies in the 80s, about Canadian special forces and spies doing extraordinary things overseas. They have a very aggressive diplomatic style with our friends, allies, and neutral countries across the globe. And lastly, they have their own false narrative about the South China Sea, Taiwan, and its relationship to its neighbors as well. Oh, and Chairman Xi has told us what he will do as well, saying unification with Taiwan is the great trend of history, and he has specifically noted that the use of force is an option. And now, I'm sure he's taking a lesson or three from Putin's invasion and the world's response. Most importantly, what do we make of this? What should we make of this? I know this: a failure of deterrence in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere in the East China Sea, that's Korea, Japan, or South China Sea, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, etc., Thailand. A failure of deterrence in those places would be an even bigger disaster. If you think the economy is bad when we remove Russia's mere 8% of US imported oil and gas, what do we think the global economy will look like when 92% of the world's most sophisticated semiconductors come from Taiwan? How about the fact that China already controls 55% of the world's rare earth mining and 85% of its refining? How about when the world's first, United States, second, China, and third largest economies, Japan, are all immediately affected? What happens then? The Russian stock market was closed for a month before partially reopening, and it's a mess. What stock markets might close because of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait? The Taiwan Stock Exchange? Maybe no one here is invested there. Shanghai? City as big as New York? Hong Kong? Tokyo? Singapore? New York? I know there's a stock exchange on that list that people here are invested in. Apple, Disney, Goldman Sachs, Exxon, GM, and other US companies are pulling business or more from Russia. What business impacts occur in a Taiwan Strait or East or South China Sea conflict in China, Taiwan, Japan, the United States? And given the fact that the US, China, and Japan are the first, second, and third largest economies, who would embargo whom? I know it will be too late to wait until Taiwan is ruined. It will be too late to wait until the global economy is ruined. It is absolutely in our interest to prevent outcomes like this, even as far away as Ukraine and Taiwan. For the United States and for the world, there is much to be done, economically, diplomatically, and yes, as I said, militarily, in the region, the Indo-Pacific. Indeed, the world, to prevent this from happening. We must deter such adventurism by China. We must deter Russia from further activities. And we must prevent any other that would destroy the world's interests for the sake of their own. So for the United States, what do we need to do? All right, first, we have to recognize America's role in the world. An academic by the name of Robert Kagan reminded us last year that the international order is of America's own making since World War II. The international order is of America's own making, or it won't be. This means we have to recognize that our core interests, and by that I mean our prosperity and our security, are best served by the efforts we put into international organizations, our various alliances, our economic institutions, and our security organizations, and that we will help administer them and lead them in peacetime and in war. I know, personally, all too well, we must often, and most often, no matter how frustrating, conceive, collaborate, convince, cooperate, cajole, and capitalize the international community in the things that matter most. But it must be done. If not, who will do it? And who do we think will benefit if someone else doesn't. Power loves a vacuum, and we only need to look at an authoritarian power like Putin or Chairman Xi to know that they will desire to fill it. Second, we have to understand the very important changes that are happening in Asia. Before this decade is over, 2/3 of the world's population and 2/3 of the global economy will be centered on Asia. 7 of the world's 10 largest militaries, that includes us, are located in the Indo-Pacific right now. 4 of the 5 largest economies in the world by the end of the decade. There are important international issues moving from the back burner to the front when it comes to our long-term security and economic interests. And the rising power of China and their willingness to coerce, to corrupt, and co-opt others in the region is meant to undermine the security landscape in a way that convinces all others, and that includes us, that the cost of denying the PRC's ambitions are too high for us to oppose. But we have to recognize that the long-term interests critical to the United States here, they're happening in space policy, in cyberspace policy, in cryptocurrency and our reserve currency policy, in trade, in telecommunications, in energy security, in the freedom of the seas and skies. They're all at stake. If we don't engage, China will. And they will write the rules. They will determine the outcomes for, again, 2/3 of the world's population and 2/3 of the global economy before the decade is out. And with Chairman Xi, whether internally, like in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong, or externally, like the line of actual control, the border between India and China, where they were battling a couple of years ago, they still are, or potentially with Taiwan, there is always the use of force option on his table. Lastly, we must remember our nation, the world's largest economy by GDP, has the weight, the standing, and the influence with others to deter Chairman Xi and the Communist Party of China's already stated objective to subjugate its neighbors, disrupt the international world order, and replace it with one with Chinese characteristics. We know from the real world that it is in our interest to prevent that from happening. We must deter, again, such adventurism by China, by Russia, and by any other that would destroy the world's interests for their own. It only takes the will. The rest of the world is counting on us. Think about what they make of all this. Not Putin, not Xi, not the United States, not Japan, not Australia, not the rest of the world. Countries like Ukraine and Taiwan. Is their cause worthy of us? Is it in our interest? If not, what is their choice? Do they abandon the international order, their relationship with us, and submit to arbitrary and despotic rule like Russia and China? In that case, do you think they will be free to exchange with us, trade with us, share their innovations or ideas with us? How about us with them? Does our prosperity and our security depend upon those exchanges? I'll tell you what I think the rest of the world is really pondering. They're really wondering, are we worthy of them? That's the judgment they're trying to make. NATO has been galvanized, for now, by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Let it galvanize our will with our allies in the Indo-Pacific to deter China from any military or coercive adventurism as well. I know it is hard work, but it is better to do that work now while we can think and act to prevent war before anything is in ruins. It is in our nation's interest, and you need to look back no farther than Thomas Paine to be reminded of that. He told us the cause of all mankind depends upon it. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to answering